Hello and welcome to Rolling in Mills, and today we have Punch Drunk Love, the 2002 Paul Thomas Anderson film. Now, excluding probably Inherent Vice only, this is like by far the most absurd, weird, and all-around strange Paul Thomas Anderson film I think there is. I think Inherent Vice is very comedic, and is very strange, and is very particularly visual for him, but this is like kind of in a league of its own. Even in terms of something like runtime, where this only goes for something like 95 minutes compared to all of his other films, which are basically 2.5 hours to, 3 hours plus. For me, Anderson kind of represents like very good usage of basically stealing Robert Altman's style, especially in relation to films like Shortcuts in Nashville, where he does these really great, quite complex character dramas that, they're like quite long films, 2.5 hours plus is common. I think There Will Be Blood is like over 3 hours, and it's these really complex, really great, like slow burning films. And even something like Inherent Vice, which is kind of crazy, very absurd and surreal, and I love it for that, that's still a really slow burn. It's this really great unfolding mystery film. But here you have this really crazy, maddeningly fastly paced film, and it's only 90 minutes of course, and it reminds me quite a bit of Jacques Tattie's Playtime in that it has this never-ending, constant soundtrack. The soundtrack here is fascinating and disturbing and really, it's maddening is the only word I can think of. The drums, the crazy like jazz flares, it's very unique, especially for an Anderson film.
They called me because they're having a party tonight, so they're just calling me. Give me 2 more minutes, okay?
The film basically follows Adam Sandler, who, this is probably, his only really good performance that I've ever seen. Apparently he's good in that film, The Comedians, or something. I've never seen that, but that's the only other, really true, serious film he's done. And here, I'm not sure if I'd call this film serious. It's definitely got a lot of comedic elements to it, but it isn't like a straight up, a Sandler comedy, and I think we're all pretty much on the same page here in what, you should be expecting with a modern Sandler comedy. I'm not talking about something like Happy Gilmore, which is just a pretty average film in my mind. I'm talking about something like fucking Jack and Jill, the bane of all cinematic existence, the true void. You stare into Jack and Jill, and the Jack and Jill stares back into you. Sandler just does a fantastic job playing this like really socially awkward, frantic, non-communicative, and really anger-ridden person who for some reason is like a themed toilet plunger salesman. I think that's that one line, themed toilet plunger salesman, really indicates the tone of this film and just kind of the quirkiness and the randomness of it. Now, as a whole, I'm not a huge fan of really wacky, quirky films, but it doesn't really play it up here, One of the opening scenes is Adam Sandler is, like walking outside, or he's just outside, and he sees a truck drive past, someone unloads a fucking harmonium and then just drives off, and then he just like keeps it for the rest of the film. Like, that's like a major plot point for him, but I don't ever feel like they really overplay that, like, whoa, the universe is crazy, all these characters are crazy. It does keep that level of absurdity to it rather than like disgusting quirkiness. I can see some people really not enjoying this because it's so absurd, especially people who like the previous types of films that Paul Thomas Anderson did. They might not love this kind of style coming out of him. This film kind of reminds me of like almost a very, very light-hearted version of Synecdoche, New York. And the other reason for that, of course, is that they both have Philip Seymour Hoffman in them, even though Philip Seymour Hoffman's role in this film, and I'm not going to really spoil this at all, is quite minor but very pronounced. His presence in the film is just great, even though he doesn't have a huge amount of screen time. But they both have that like bizarre, very Kafkaesque tone to them, where it's this kind of ever-increasing absurd scenarios. Like, the main plotline of this film is that Adam Sandler, because he's like a very lonely, kind of confused person, starts talking to people on a like sex hotline, but then the sex hotline person he's talking to begins to try to like blackmail him, and then that person's pimp turns out to be Philip Seymour Hoffman, who's like a mattress salesman for some reason, and you just kind of keep on getting that escalation of insanity and weirdness. It's so like unique for a character that I've seen, and it's very rare for a character like that to be the protagonist. Actually, one of the only other films I can think of where the protagonist of the film is such a weird, kind of autistic person, it'd be like The Social Network, but at least that character is kind of surrounded by more normal people. Here, Sandler is kind of surrounded by equally weird people, just on different ends of the spectrum. Like, he deals with his sisters who are just horrible, really overbearing people. And then you have Philip Seymour Hoffman, who, yet again, not spoiling, but his character is just completely bonkers. And I think that not only his performance is fantastic, but the whole aesthetic that the film has built around him is just incredible in terms of contributing to that sense of just frantic, insane pace. I mentioned the soundtrack of this film being very crazy, and I also referenced Playtime, and I think Playtime is another film where not only is the kind of the plot of the film based around this kind of frantic obsession, but it's the aesthetic basically makes that film, the visual style, the music. Everything outside of the writing basically makes that film as crazy and as frantic as it is. And that's the same here, but there's more of a focus, I suppose, on dialogue, on character, and then the visuals and the soundtrack really contribute towards and accentuate Adam Sandler's performance here. Something I love about the visual design in this film, and it is very unique for Paul Thomas Anderson, I think, like again with Inherent Vice, that seems to be, with Punch Drunk Love, the only two films in his filmography that are very visually distinct. He often uses a lot of tracking shots, and while his framing and blocking is nice, he doesn't seem to have a very distinct style. But here, you just have this crazy, constant moving, you know. There's quite a bit of tracking in Boogie Nights, in Magnolia, in There'll Be Blood, but here it is almost constant, and the shot lengths are really long. And that allows for these amazing tracking sequences that aren't so much impressive on like a technical level as something like, I don't know, like a Tarkovsky tracking shot, but they're more impressive in terms of they allow this, you know, build up across, you know, 3, 5, 7 minutes of just the insanity. The insanity just builds and builds, and the music gets greater and greater until you have this burst. Or sometimes you don't have a burst and it kind of subverts that by undercutting or just cutting away, so you don't even get that like cathartic release from the insanity. And doing those types of scenes in tracking shots and just having to hold on Sandler pacing back and forth from somewhere, and hearing, you know, say for this one scene there's all these phones ringing, he's going to another place, he's having to try play some harmonium, all these people are talking to him, he's having to deal with so many things at once, and the music is just it's just killer. And when Adam Sandler does finally burst, because his character is kind of known for violently lashing out, there's this horrible but wonderfully done part where Sandler is going to a house party with his family, with his sisters, and as he walks in the door, you can just hear them like really loudly talking about how he did some like horrible, really embarrassing thing as a child, and they're telling everyone, like their grandkids, and even when they see him they keep on talking about it and bringing it up, and he really obviously doesn't want to talk about it, but they just keep going, and it's just a really strong sense of cringe and anger going, you know, in tandem, and I think that's quite a unique sensation / tone to go for a film. But like I was saying, when Sandler does burst in anger, it's shot almost with like reduced sound and from quite a distance away, so it almost undercuts and shows how futile and kind of petty his anger is. You know, I can imagine in another film we'd see like, you know, the big burst, the big cathartic release, to be shot very powerfully, for there to be this like swelling release of music, for it to really accentuate the power of it. But here, all of the power comes in the ramp up of the tension, and then the big finale, the climax, is totally undercut in every way through the aesthetic, and I think that's a really cool approach. It's really nice. It's a good tie-in of aesthetic, of tension, underlying, you know, the futility and desperation of his character. And I mentioned the film being Kafkaesque, and I think that's kind of what Kafka's books are all about. It's just this like overwhelming sense of despair, like all these things are bearing down on you, and any attempt to lash out against them just does nothing, and your attempts are all futile. But on the point of visuals, and I do really like it for the most part, there is a very strange use of constant lens flares, and this isn't really something prevalent in really many of Paul Thomas Anderson's other films, and it's really prevalent here. They're in every, you know, almost every scene basically, and I can't really discern why. I'm not inherently against them. I know lots of people just hate lens flares, and I think J.J. Abrams is kind of like the go-to, and I think the guy does overuse lens flares quite a lot, especially like the digital lens flares. I just don't understand the appeal of that, honestly. But I'm not like inherently against them, and I'm not inherently against their use in this film. I'm just not really sure why they're there aesthetically, visually. I don't think they really contribute a huge amount besides just kind of looking cool. But then in that case, why aren't they in Paul Thomas Anderson's other films? And on the point of just kind of random visual elements, there are these strange, like, psychedelic visual interludes between some scenes, and yet again, I'm not sure really what purpose they serve. They seem to be completely removed from the narrative, and they're really quite jarring. Yet again, I don't hate them, I really like the look of them. I checked this out, and they're done by this guy called Jeremy Blake, but I couldn't really find any information on him besides the fact that he was involved in some like weird ritual murder thing that somehow involved Scientologists. All very, very bizarre, but I couldn't really find any reason why these interludes were in this film. Yet again, not because I dislike them, but it was just kind of like, oh, this is cool. Why is it in the film though? Now just onto some other, little random points to close off. I love the way that the harmonium being dropped in the street is shot. As I mentioned, the whole film is pretty flowing. Visually, it's quite nice to look at, but there's just this sequence where when it's dropped, it becomes very, very symmetrical. There's just this series of shots that really just strikes to me of being very much like a Kubrick film. In particular, like the 2001: A Space Odyssey monolith lining up with the planets sequence. It feels like this random event has been like ordained by the universe in some way, or it's caused by that, where everything becomes symmetrical and everything kind of falls into place all of a sudden. Also, I just love the shot where Sandler is like about to board a plane, and he's got his plane ticket, and you see him kind of walking / half like kind of running towards the flight attendants, and it just captures that moment of like, you're too far away from them to kind of start handing out your ticket. And it's the same of like shaking someone's hand, like when you're going in, do you go in from a distance, do you go in too close? And it really just captures that perfectly.
As they drew nearer, their eyes locked, uncertain if the other was gonna stop to talk. The person greeted Bill, as Bill mixed up the phrases, "What's up?" with "How's it going?" Confused, the person blurted out, "Thanks," before he knew what he was saying. Words caught in Bill's throat, and he replied, "Way."
Also, I totally forgot to mention, but I love the way that this film just randomly breaks into these like almost fantasy elements. And it's not overtly stated, and I'm not exactly sure what's really meant to be going on in these scenes, but it will just take very, very short breaks where it'll just become a fantasy film, basically. For example, there's a scene where Adam Sandler kind of leaves after going on a date with someone, and then miraculously comes back, kicks down the door, kind of swoops in to hold her and kisses her, which is, really ridiculous compared to the rest of the film. And then there's another scene where he gets confronted by these brothers who want to beat him up, and he just wonderfully and very fluidly just absolutely completely wrecks all of them. And the very strange thing is that these aren't played like their fantasy. They're played just like they're just a part of the film. And if they are fantastical, then we're never really shown what really happened during these scenes, if he really was miraculously beating the shit out of these guys like a fucking expert, or he just perfectly swooped in on this girl that before he'd been very awkward around. Anyway, I would consider this an 83 out of 100. I don't think it's mind-blowing or anything, but it's a really solid film, and by far the weirdest Paul Thomas Anderson film. This is such an enigma. It's a really interesting change of pace from his other stuff, and Sandler's performance is just amazing. And I mean, why can he not be in more stuff like this? This is fucking great. Just stop making shit films, you fuck. Anyway, that's it. Ciao.